Okay, ladies and gentlemen, let's make a start. Good evening. My name is Matthew Harries. I'm a research fellow here at the IISS. I'm also managing editor of Survival, the Institute's journal. I'm very pleased to be able to welcome you to tonight's event on the Syrian Jihad. After the attack on Paris, the implications of this topic for Western security are on the front page of every newspaper. But we have here two analysts who have been following these issues at very close hand in the Middle East for a number of years. And I think this is a great time to be having a discussion rooted in regional insecurity produced by the war in Syria, as well as the ways that that insecurity is exported elsewhere. So let me introduce our two speakers. To my left is Charles Lister, who is a visiting fellow at the Brookings Institution Doha Center. He's the author of a new book published only this week, The Syrian Jihad, Al-Qaeda, the Islamic State, and the Evolution of an Insurgency. To my right is Emil Hokaim, the IISS Senior Fellow for Middle East Security, based in our Middle East office in Bahrain. He is the author, among other things, of a 2013 Adelphi book, Syria's Uprising and the Fracturing of the Levant. So the way this is going to work is Charles will speak for 15 to 20 minutes. Emil will act as discussant and speak for around 5 minutes, hopefully asking some difficult questions. And we'll have 30 minutes or so for you for question and answers. We are on the record this evening. We're streaming on the website, so please do feel free to tweet and to talk about the evening's proceedings once you've left. What remains is to say, Charles, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, and I think that's on. Yeah, and thank you very much. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming. For the purposes of keeping space for an effective question and answer session, which I always find is perhaps the most valuable part of events like this, I'll speak for about 15 minutes and try and present some big picture ideas and main points that I would probably suggest are worth bearing in mind when looking at Syria today, particularly with regards to the growth of jihadist militancy and the rising influence of Islamists in general within the opposition. You know, a fundamental point of Syria is how it's developed and how it's been allowed to deteriorate over the last 4.5 years has established Syria as a country, as a territory, which is an inherently fertile ground for the growth, the consolidation, and the continued expansion, at least in my opinion, of jihadist militancy, independent of or as a result of international intervention. The complexity of the conflict, as well as the death of 300,000 people in 4.5 years, the displacement of nearly half of the entire population to about approximately 10.7 million people are now both internally and externally displaced people. But the complexity of the conflict in and of itself has provided a vacuum, has provided an opportunity for organizations like Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State and at least a dozen other jihadist factions to establish early footholds in the conflict through which they can then exploit the seeming intractability of the conflict, the complexity coming out of it, and of course the brutality and the suffering of the people. I guess, you know, in order to sort of underline that fertility of Syria for jihadist militancy, one of the most effective ways, at least I find, is to explain in relatively simple terms quite how complex the conflict in Syria has become in terms of who's involved. And I think probably, you know, I think some people in the past have done a count of all of the countries who have some kind of stake in the conflict, and it almost covers half of the countries in the world who have some kind of stake in what's going on in Syria. To briefly describe all of the actors, on the pro-Assad side, in terms of my estimation, the Syrian Arab Army probably still manages to deploy and make some use of in a defensive or offensive capacity, approximately 100,000 soldiers or members on the ground. Many Syrians on the ground today in pro-regime areas, with pro-regime standpoints, however, will and continue to describe the Syrian Arab Army as no longer an army in and of itself, but more a coalescence of semi-independent militias acting under the guise of the Syrian Arab Army, and still being commanded largely by Syrians. But that kind of incapacitation of the Syrian Arab Army as a single organization quite early on resulted in the establishment of the National Defense Forces, which probably doubles the armed, another 100,000. So it supplements by 100% the manpower that the Syrian Arab Army has been able to introduce into the conflict. And then on top of that, you have approximately 25 to 30,000 Shia militiamen from Iraq, from Syria, from Lebanon, and from many other countries as far afield as places like Afghanistan. So just the pro-Assad forces in Syria are, fairly significant in terms of numbers, but also genuinely international in terms of their support structures and actually who they represent. The anti-Assad side, very briefly, probably roughly 80,000 to 100,000 rebels, plus probably 15,000 Al-Qaeda or pro-Al-Qaeda militants. The reason I classify Al-Qaeda as part of the opposition is because that's exactly A, how they present themselves, and B, how they are acknowledged by much of the Syrian opposition, partly or mostly as a result of their quote-unquote pragmatism throughout much of the revolution, at least pragmatism in comparison to the traditional Al-Qaeda kind of behavior. Separate to opposition forces, you of course have the Islamic State. Again, probably 10 to 15,000 fighters, predominantly in the east and the northeast of the country. We can probably go more into this in the question and answer session. I'm sure it will be an important subject of discussion, but I personally think the Islamic State in Syria in particular is actually facing a number of quite significant challenges at the moment, both internally within their organization, but also in terms of potential threats, both from several prominent areas of tribal influence in eastern and northeastern Syria, but also in terms of a number of potentially significant plans that the US-led coalition has to work with various different opposition and Kurdish forces in the next several months. I mentioned the Kurds because they, as is probably very well known in the audience, the Kurds have also emerged as a quite pivotal actor in Syria, largely as a result of the fact that the US-led coalition has developed them as probably the key anti-ISIL actor in Syria. They have been effective on the battlefield. I think there's absolutely no doubt about that. But certainly in terms of my engagement with the armed Syrian opposition, which has been quite extensive over the last 2 years, very face-to-face engagement with the leaderships of over 100 of the most powerful armed opposition groups in Syria. The role of the Kurds is an extremely, or more specifically speaking, the PYD and its armed wing, the YPG, is an extremely difficult issue. An almost universal value crossing across many pro-regime circles as well as the broad spectrum of the opposition. An almost universal value there and a red line is the partition of Syria. And an additional red line amongst almost the entire opposition is any suggestion of federalism, or let alone autonomy for the Kurds. So the PYD's role has been particularly divisive, actually, within the opposition, and more, almost by a month-by-month basis, the level of trust and suspicion about the Western world's intentions with Syria as a united country as a result of their relationship with the PYD is becoming increasingly detrimental within the opposition. And it's something really, really, really worth bearing in mind. And it also raises a frustration. Western, to go off slightly on a tangent, Western policy in Syria at the moment is dominated by being focused on counterterrorism and quite specifically countering ISIL. But it seems to have almost been forgotten that at the beginning of 2014, in the space of 5 to 6 weeks, the largely Sunni opposition forced ISIL out of 4.5 provinces in 5 to 6 weeks. And with close US air support and the rest of the coalition, Kurds have probably pushed ISIL out of about a third of a province in a year. So if we're genuinely interested in both durably, sustainably, and quickly pushing ISIL out of territory, we seem to be missing a trick. Especially considering the fact that now that even the PYD itself is coming out and saying, listen, we recognize we can't start pushing further south from the northeast corner of the country into what is in effect a much more Arab-dominated area of Syria. And this is going to pose really, really serious issues in the months to come, especially if the PYD is pushed, as some suspect, to nonetheless play a significant role in pushing further south into these Arab areas. To very briefly list, we of course have the entire international anti-ISIL coalition. We also have separate American anti-Al-Qaeda operations. We have the Russian military intervention, we have Iran's role in backing the regime, in forming paramilitary organizations as well as Shia militias across Syria. And of course we have all of the countries on Syria's borders who are all equally involved in protecting their kind of spheres of influence around the borders, whether it be Israel, whether it be Lebanon, whether it be Turkey or Jordan, and to some limited extent Iraq. And of course we have the very significant role of countries like Qatar and Turkey and Saudi Arabia in my view quite detrimentally, having ploughed money and weapons into the opposition over the last 4.5 years in a rather unorganized fashion. So to cut that long story short, the complexity, the intractability, the internationalization or the international nature of the conflict, the effect that has had upon engendering at least a perception that Syria is at least partly driven by a sectarian dynamic, and the increasing blurring of international borders. All of that has provided fertile ground for jihadists to have established themselves, to have expanded, to have consolidated their territorial control in vast areas of Syria. Now, within that context of jihadists having established themselves on Syrian territory, a major sort of theory I put forward in my book is that kind of two models of jihad, two relatively new or refined models of jihad, have emerged in Syria specifically as a result of the kind of dynamics that have been present in that country. The first one, of course, is the Islamic State. The second is Al-Qaeda. The Islamic State's model of jihad has probably existed for quite some time, but I think in many ways it has become increasingly clear in the Syrian context. Of course, it's very well known. They rely on a deeply sectarian narrative. They rely on horrific use of brutal violence in order to destabilize society, in order to demoralize the perception of effective governance, to polarize communities, and then by extension to mobilize communities on their side by presenting themselves as a socio-religious alternative. And in certain areas of Syria, I think this is perhaps becoming less the case now, but in certain areas of Syria for quite some time, that actually worked quite effectively. ISIL was enforcing itself on some people, but there were also several fairly significant swathes of territory where people were fairly happy to be taken under ISIL's control for some time early on, especially following Mosul's fall. But perhaps the most important element of ISIL's model of jihad, and I would clarify by saying this may be coming into question following the attacks in Paris, is the fact that its inherent strategy is local. Their entire focus is on shaping local conditions in order to gain influence, leverage, and then control. And then once they control, it is upon consolidating that control and in many cases investing in those local communities to ensure that they establish a kind of mutually interdependent relationship between the people and the Islamic State. And that localism has differed to the traditional Al-Qaeda model, which always kept an eye on the far enemy. And in other Al-Qaeda zones of influence around the world in the last 10 to 15 years, that keeping an eye on the far enemy has actually proven somewhat of a disadvantage to Al-Qaeda affiliates, because local people took on the perception that this organization doesn't only have our best interests at heart, but in fact they have a greater objective which is outside our borders. And that has, in many cases, proven, perhaps subtly, but proven to be a fairly significant disadvantage for Al-Qaeda, and perhaps I'll mention that a little bit more when I describe Al-Qaeda's kind of new or refined model which has emerged in Syria. But on ISIL specifically, that localism has allowed it to truly kind of, establish an iron grip over communities, and it is an iron grip. I think the level of acceptance of their control is perhaps lessening over time, and that potentially presents an opportunity for the US-led coalition and the international community. But nonetheless, that localism is an extremely important dynamic to to appreciate. But of course, as I mentioned, the attacks in Paris may potentially be changing, or they may potentially be suggesting that model may have since evolved. So if the attacks in Paris were centrally coordinated, centrally planned from Syria and Iraq, then that would suggest that perhaps ISIL is adopting the more traditional Al-Qaeda model of having an eye on the far enemy, as opposed to what they've done over the last year or so, which has been to rely on influencing or inspiring, to use Al-Qaeda's terminology, individuals or influenced individuals around the world to carry out attacks on its behalf, but without necessarily being official members of the organization. So maybe this is changing, but maybe it's not. I just don't think we know yet. But the Al-Qaeda model is the one that I actually find perhaps more interesting, and I actually also think it's more important. Al-Qaeda's affiliate in Syria, Jabhat al-Nusra, has made a name for itself within the jihadist analyst community, within the Syrian community, and elsewhere, for having adopted a new model whereby they treat Syria, or they treat Syrians as, for want of a better word, they treat them like children, like innocent people who don't quite understand what it means to live in a pure Islamic society. And I use that terminology because it's the exact terminology that prominent Al-Qaeda strategists have used in the last 4 years, in the cases of both Yemen and Mali. In fact, in Mali specifically, just as AQIM and other affiliated groups were taking control of territory in the northeast of that country, senior strategists both in North Africa and also in Saudi Arabia began sending letters to their commanders in Mali, literally using the language. They described Mali as a baby. They said, Mali is your child. You cannot expect your child to understand everything with regards to what should be expected of it and how to live in a truly pure Islamic society. You need to start teaching them the basics, the simple ideas first. And only over a very, very long-term process do you start to introduce the much more, the much stricter, the much more difficult to follow expectations within their perception of a pure Islamic society. And through that way, you socialize a community into thinking the way you think over a long period of time. And after that long period of time, that population belongs to you. You don't control them, they belong to you, and you belong to them. So there's that interdependent relationship, which is then by extension very difficult to break, especially from the outside. It failed in Mali because very quickly they imposed extremely harsh levels of Sharia, and they were chopping people's hands off within several weeks. But Syria has been what I would describe as a genuinely effective refinement of that strategy. Very rarely do you hear of Jabhat al-Nusra chopping hands off, beheading people, executing people on the streets. They certainly don't do the even more horrific things like throwing homosexual people off buildings that ISIL does. They really have genuinely minimized the extent to which they have been imposing those kinds of behavioral norms and expectations on the people. And the result of that is that in my experience, having engaged, as I say, with basically the entire Syrian armed opposition for the last couple of years, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to get anyone to say a bad thing about Jabhat al-Nusra. And their reply is, if I say, well, they're Al-Qaeda, you can't possibly want an Al-Qaeda vision for Syria. And they say, well, they do call themselves Al-Qaeda, but at the same time, what have they done wrong to us? All they've ever done is fight Assad. They fight Assad very well. And all they've ever done is invest in our societies. They've protected us from the regime by and large. and we've seen nothing bad from them. So if we see something bad from them, then of course we'll turn against them. But for now, we have no reason to do so. And this is a serious issue for the international community, particularly considering the fact that they have, over a period of time, although it's thought to have stopped now, had cells planning attacks against the West. And it's that kind of long-term strategy that they do, I believe, have in mind of establishing a truly concrete foothold from which they can start launching international operations one day in the future. Now, it may be that by doing so one day down the line, and that may be years from now, they lose a substantial portion of their Syrian foot soldiers, because I don't actually think the entirety of Jabhat al-Nusra buys into this international vision. But nonetheless, that foothold will have been concretely established if it isn't already now. And for that reason, and I'll probably conclude here, for that reason, one of the principal arguments I make in many recent articles and also in the book is that our obsession with ISIL, which is partly understandable, of course, is clouding our vision of what Al-Qaeda is planning in Syria. And Al-Qaeda, in my opinion, has a far more durable and sustainable base of operations in Syria than ISIL does. ISIL represents a far easier adversary, if only we were using the right people to fight them. And with that cheery note, I'll end.
Well, Charles, thank you very much. 1, for explaining an incredibly complex conflict. 2, for giving us something else to worry about. And 3, for starting to bring out these tensions between the global and the local and the short term and the long term, which are really interesting and which I think that hopefully we can get into more in the Q&A. Emil.
Thank you. Good evening. First, I want to commend Charles on all his research. I haven't had time to go through his book. Look how sick it is, so you can't really blame me for it. But certainly this is going to be my travel companion for the next few days. I hope no one at any airport stops me and asks me embarrassing questions about it. But Charles is an analyst who has contributed immensely to our understanding of Syria, Syrian dynamics. I mean, he has taken seriously the nuances, the factionalism among the rebellion, and has produced excellent work all these years. So congratulations on the book. I look forward to more books. I was looking at the list of rebel groups that you have at the end here, and I realized that there are many that I don't know, which worries me because I'm supposed to also be a Syria analyst. But it gives you a sense of the complexity and the kind of work that Charles did in the past couple of years. Just quickly, a few points. Listening to you, knowing your research, and following the broader issue of Syria. The first one, the first consideration I have is about this whole discussion that's happening now about whether we're about to see a great sorting out within the Salafi jihadi world. That somehow the Russian escalation, the French escalation, the Vienna process, etc., are all contributing to somehow clarifying the human terrain in Syria. I'm a bit skeptical. At the same time, there's some signs here, right? I mean, what Jund al-Aqsa did. I don't want to go too much in detail, but to what extent is that true? I mean, I ask this question in part because the international community has taken on this responsibility to the Vienna process to identify terrorist groups. This is one of the clauses in the Vienna communique. For the life of me, I don't understand why anyone would want to get into that very complex process where you have diplomats, intelligence people, etc., sitting in another country and trying to define who's a terrorist and who's not a terrorist in Syria, and who should be at the negotiation table and who should not be. So I'm curious about your thought about this issue, because it is increasing. We hear increasing noise about this. The second point is really about this current discussion, and I know you and I agree on that one, but it's really about the prioritization of ISIS versus Assad that's going on. I mean, there is a very and growing camp that basically says Assad is a fight for another day. You have to focus on ISIS, and that the argument is not that simplistic. I mean, there is one argument that says we will worry about Assad later, about the process to push him out, but there is also a camp that's basically saying let's work with Assad in the process of weakening ISIS. I know where you stand on this issue, but I would like to hear your thought about this, because for me, this matter of sequencing is profoundly problematic. I think that you work the two tracks in parallel because and you figure out a way to reinforce each other, the two tracks, from the other. You don't see them as distinct. So, a question for you. A third issue that I would like to raise is this question of whether jihadis move from group to group or no longer. I mean, are we talking about very specific? I mean, have we seen in recent times people moving from Jabhat al-Nusra to ISIS? I mean, I suspect I know the answer, but why is it so? Why not? And what about the other jihadi groups? I mean, and by the way, if you want to give us your sense of how one classifies a group like Ahrar al-Sham, which is perhaps the most prominent rebel group in Syria, but exists in that gray zone. On one hand, they have Al-Qaeda elements. On the others, they publish op-eds in the Washington Post and the Telegraph saying, "Take us seriously. We're part of the future of Syria. We're not jihadis." So I'm curious about your take on this one. And then you mentioned to that the perception of Jabhat al-Nusra being, the good jihadis in Syria. And you made a compelling point, and I agree with you, that our obsession with ISIS makes us miss, how Jabhat al-Nusra is becoming part of the fabric of Syrian society. I mean, do you fight Jabhat al-Nusra heads-on, or I mean, what is the strategy here? I suspect that if you wanted to fight Jabhat al-Nusra heads-on, you basically would lose the support of many factions that you need against ISIS. Or if it's a fight for the next day, how do you make sure to avoid any entanglement with Jabhat al-Nusra in the process? I mean, this is a very tricky situation, because I agree with you. I mean, Jabhat al-Nusra is the long-term threat. Finally, one quick point. I'm very glad you mentioned the fact that the biggest setback that ISIS suffered is not, the internationally supported Kurdish fight against ISIS, but it was an indigenous push in Syria in early 2014 that actually succeeded to a large extent. That's something we really couldn't build on, because we never really took rebel factions seriously to support that process. Do you think that this is a lesson that is being learned, or is this something that is, belongs to the past? That essentially we missed the boat on this, and we have to, rethink totally new alliances in Syria to fight ISIS. I'll stop here. Toby is happy that I kept brief. But again, I commend you for all your work, and thanks for your contribution to our understanding of this very complex matter. Thank you.
Thanks, Emil. You were asked to provide difficult questions, and you definitely didn't disappoint. I think it would be good to hear some voices from the floor, so let's take a round of questions and come back to Charles. Two things about questions. One, we're a large group in a large room, so please do say who you are and where you're from at the start of your question, and please do try to keep it as succinct as possible. With that, the floor is open. Yes, the gentleman in the second row.
My name is Shamsul Arifin. I'm a member of this institute. While we're talking about insurgency in Syria, are we not failing to recognize the elephant in the room, that is the funding for this terrorism. You mentioned in your speech earlier on that Saudi Arabia and Qatar are supplying them funds as well as the weapons. So what action are we taking to stop those two countries doing that? Who are financing terrorism not only in Syria, but well beyond that, Iraq, Pakistan, Afghanistan? And why, don't you think it's a hypocrisy of Western countries that they're not talking about those two countries and not taking any action against those two countries because they have vested interest there? Why are they turning blind eyes to that?
Thank you. I can see Ben Barry.
Thanks. I'm the Land Warfare Fellow here at the Institute. Charles, what would be your advice to the leaders of the anti-ISIS coalition about what they should be thinking of next?
Thanks. And the gentleman in the front row on the left here.
I got some brief comments, not any question.
In that case, please do try to keep them brief. And if
I
something
will.
could end with a question mark,
I will,
that
because
would
I
be
know
good.
other people might have to participate. At present, it's necessary to degrade and, if possible, destroy IS state. However, IS, Al-Qaeda, Taliban, Boko Haram, and Pakistan-based Haqqanis and LET are all Sunni terrorist organizations supported by extremist Saudi Wahhabi ideology, funds from Saudi Arabia and Gulf states, and support by some other countries. But due to geopolitics of oil and Saudi economic carrots to the West, we always try to blame Iran for global Islamic terrorism, which I think is not fully justified. Unless the West acknowledges the facts and confronts Sunni, Saudi Arabia and Gulf states, there will be no end to terrorism. So it's up to us if we want to stop it or not. Thank you.
Thanks very much. So, where does the money come from? Advice for the anti-ISIS coalition, and why Sunni extremism?
Okay. Do you want me to reply to Emil's
Yeah, go ahead.
discussion points as well? Okay, how long do we have? Like another hour? Or okay, well, I'll start with the questions, and then I'll go to Emil's points. Funding terrorism. It's a difficult question to ask. I assume you mean, I assume you didn't mean that Saudi Arabia is funding ISIL or Al-Qaeda, because they're not. But there are certainly people in similar countries, including Saudi Arabia, who are. And that is something that needs to be fixed. Al-Qaeda has always relied on a quite well-developed network of private financiers. There are conspiracy theories in the region that Saudi Arabia has funded ISIL in order to destabilize Shia power. But my personal assessment, I've never seen any evidence of that. I've never bought into that theory, which I do call a conspiracy theory. ISIL is approximately 90 to 95% internally funded. It has developed that strategy over at least the previous decade for a very obvious reason, because it's an insurance policy. It's very difficult to counter terrorism financing, which is internally raised. But Al-Qaeda, which probably relates more to your question and also to yours, is a serious issue. There is, as I say, a fairly extensive network of individuals who use a variety of means to send money to places like Syria and elsewhere to fund organizations linked to Al-Qaeda. It's very well known. The United Nations and the US and many foreign governments do their best to counter this. But yes, it's definitely a fair point that certain countries don't do enough internally, domestically, to stop things. And certainly, some of it is well reported and some of it isn't. But there is a well accepted reality that certain individuals are given free rein to travel between countries like Kuwait and Qatar. And then to send money through unofficial financial transfer networks to places like southern Turkey, where the money then crosses borders. So whilst I would disagree that governments are funding these groups, I would disagree very strongly, I would agree that there is still a very serious issue with regards to the private financial support of terrorist organizations, and there does need to be more work done on that. I don't really have an answer other than saying that more needs to be done. More pressure needs to be given. And when you use the word hypocrisy, I totally agree with you. Yes, there is. And I think I said the other night in another event that I watched, despite living most of my time abroad in a different country every week, I did see Jon Snow's interview with David Cameron, in which he pressed quite hard on the fact that he was making deals with countries like Saudi Arabia whilst fairly questionable things were going on in those countries. And I think there is an extent to which there is hypocrisy, but then there's also an extent to which policymakers are in a very difficult position. Many very, very wealthy countries happen to not necessarily be nice democracies, but when your domestic situation is relying on trying to raise money or create new business opportunities, sometimes you don't necessarily have much of a choice. But that's why I'm not in government, so I don't have to make these kinds of decisions. The simple answer, advice to an anti-ISIL, I hope I kind of answered both of the questions together. Advice to the anti-ISIL coalition, well, from my specific experience, it would be to point to what I said in my original comments. Far better and more extensive engagement needs to take place with the Sunni, primarily Sunni. I hate generalizing it because they're not all Sunni. There are many Christians in the opposition. There are some Shia and Alawis within the opposition. But far more extensive engagement needs to be made with the conventional opposition, who, as I say, have a extraordinarily successful track record of fighting ISIL and forcing them out of entire provinces in weeks, which is something that I said the Kurds have totally failed to do with US air support. It's not hard to establish relationships with these kinds of groups, but it does take time. I've been doing it over the past 2 years. You have to invest an awful lot of time, drink huge amounts of coffee, stay up invariably into the late hours of the night. But once those relationships are established, they are hugely valuable, and they certainly would be in the anti-ISIL coalition. So that would be my one big piece of advice. And to briefly as I can, answer some of Emil's points. Firstly, thank you very much for your kind comments. Yes, in the process of Vienna, there is an attempt at least to try and do a great sorting out. I think the idea of creating a terrorism list at this point is stupid, for want of a better word, because it will divide the opposition when right now we are looking in a pretty desperate situation in even getting the opposition to join the Vienna process. So to now start talking about singling out some groups as not viable partners in that process just doesn't seem logical to me, to be quite honest with you. Within the great sorting out of the Islamist and jihadist factions, yes, this has been going on for a while. In fact, it's been going on since before the Russian intervention, but it has probably accelerated since. Jund al-Aqsa, which is in effect, and I talk about this in my book, is in effect, it was created as a front group of Al-Qaeda, of Jabhat al-Nusra, just shortly before ISIS emerged into Syria. It was created as an insurance policy. It was predominantly foreign fighter based at the beginning, and it was a way of ensuring that foreign fighters didn't defect to ISIS when it first emerged in Syria. There are many other organizations who play a similar role. But what was interesting was that Jund al-Aqsa just recently, it may be now coming back, but it just recently pulled out of the quite famous Jaish al-Fatah coalition in Idlib, which had essentially succeeded in capturing almost the entire province over the last 6 months. And it pulled out because it was essentially claiming, this coalition, you need to now announce, for example, they said, you need to now announce a declaration of war, not only against Russia and Iran, but against the United States. At which point, even Al-Qaeda's affiliate, Jabhat al-Nusra, turned around and said, no, this is stupid. We can't do this is not in our interest. And of course, all of the Syrians said exactly the same thing. So they withdrew. And so it's kind of like the Russian intervention has sparked a renewed thinking about where does the Syrian jihad lie within an international context. Who amongst us is truly holding on to the international jihadist vision, and who amongst you are kind of halfway houses. And in that respect, a halfway house is Ahrar al-Sham. Ahrar al-Sham is an organization that I've got to know personally very closely over the last 4.5 years, right up to the top levels of their leadership. And they are a very complicated organization. They do have former members of Al-Qaeda. They do have individuals, or have had individuals, who have not been formal members of Al-Qaeda, but have reached right up to people like Osama bin Laden, as far back as the 1980s. But at the same time, they're massively buttressed at the foot soldier level, essentially by Muslim Brotherhood. And it's this kind of battle between all of these kind of factions and outlooks and visions that is being played out at the moment. And of course, some of that has been seen in Western newspapers like the Telegraph and the Washington Post, where an interesting guy who I know very well, Labib al-Nahas, is essentially being buttressed with some international support as what I call a kind of, he's leading a kind of mainstreaming trend to try and make Ahrar al-Sham a more appetizable, more acceptable member of the opposition, and less labelled as a maybe not Al-Qaeda organisation. And the outcome of that is really unclear. I won't go to all of your points, but I think there was one that I particularly wanted to talk about. It was the Jabhat al-Nusra, how to fight. We'll never get the opposition to fight Jabhat al-Nusra within the current conditions, and Assad has to go before Syrians will even consider fighting Jabhat al-Nusra. Realistically speaking, knowing all of the guys who would do so, they will never do it until Assad is gone. Once Assad is gone, if he ever is, doing so will still be extremely difficult, and I think that was one of the main points I was trying to make in my initial comments, that they will have nonetheless been so well embedded that fighting them will be a really, really difficult battle, far more challenging than fighting against ISIS.
Thank you, Charles. That was very informative, and you covered a lot of ground there. We have time for another round of questions. The very first hand that I saw was, I think that's Sir David, if my eyesight is...
Thank you. David Richmond, a member of the Institute. I think you were saying at the beginning of your remarks, Charles, that many people really on both sides of the divide still believe strongly in a Syrian state, a unitary Syrian state. Do you believe that a unitary Syrian state is still possible in view of what you know about the way it is fragmented?
Thanks. Yes, the gentleman in the check shirt.
Hi, Luke Watson. Charles, you mentioned earlier very briefly about the tribal dynamic in Syria. We know that the Assad family has used the tribes before in the uprisings in Hama. I just really want you to kind of expand a bit more on what kind of role you think that they will play in the future, especially given the fact that nobody's going to fight Jabhat. Are we starting to see a greater push towards the tribes as a pragmatic actor to offer that kind of more moderate opposition? I mean, certainly we've seen King Abdullah pushing for that, and I know the Al-Qaeda are now in Deir ez-Zor fighting that fight on behalf of the anti-ISIS coalition.
Sure. Thanks. And one more. Yes, the gentleman in the front here. Yes.
Well, thank you. I'm a correspondent from Xinhua News Agency. It's an international news agency based in Beijing. My question is about the political and ideological differences actually over the definition of international terrorism. Actually, following the the attacks in Paris, it seems that most world powers, particularly the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, have expressed willingness to work more closely to fight against ISIL. But it seems that the Western world and the non-Western world still have some differences that actually prevent them from working more closely in the fight against the ISIL. And one of those differences is the so-called double standard issue. And so extremists killing civilians in the West is immediately recognized as terrorism. But when the same thing happened in non-Western countries, it is not always recognized in the same way. So my question is, what is your take over this double standard issue, and how should this issue be properly addressed? Thank you.
Thank you. Charles, let me add one question about the post-Paris dynamic, which is, we've seen what's happened to French policy. There's a UK vote potentially looming. let's say that anti-ISIS action is strengthened by European countries and it's successful. What are the effects of success in anti-ISIS operations on the broader dynamic of the war in Syria? What would that actually mean? What would we produce if we succeed? Thanks.
Okay, so that's a particularly difficult question. Firstly, on the United Syria, again, there's no easy answer. I mean, my personal belief, and I think I've probably been quoted saying this recently this week, is that one of the most, Syria is a desperate situation, and there's very little ground for optimism. But in my 2 years of engagement with the armed opposition and with many other types of Syrians, all minority communities, pro-regime people, etc., etc., perhaps the one single thing that does still seem to unify perhaps 90 to 95% of Syrians is the idea of what it means to be Syrian, and what Syria has meant for hundreds of years. A united Syria is, at least in my experience, as much of a red line for anyone across any spectrum of the conflict, with the exception of extremists on both sides. And so, yes, I mean, in today's context, we're now policymakers and decision makers and policymakers are meeting in places like Vienna to discuss a political solution and what does Syria look like in the future. I don't think we should buy into this kind of desperate assessment that Syria is too far gone and therefore a partition is an easy way out. In my experience, if the international community starts to push for a Syrian partition with the perception that it is an easy way out, we'll be creating multiple new wars. And so I think it would be a deeply dangerous avenue to go down. And in that sense, we should take care from taking the advice, particularly of Iran on this specific issue. But there are also some Russians who are suggesting the same thing behind the scenes. Tribes, again, I've had a lot of contact with tribal leaders across north and the east and the northeast of the country. Tribes in those areas across the north and the east of Syria do have quite substantial amount of influence over their societies, but for one reason or another during the revolution and throughout the conflict, they've kind of refused to step up and exploit that influence. They have generally demonstrated a hesitancy for risk-taking. And you can find examples of this throughout the last few years where a certain village or town will have been under the control of a certain group, and the tribal leaders come out and pledge allegiance to them, or say, we support you, we support Assad. And then 3 weeks later, they're declaring allegiance to ISIL. And this kind of chipping and changing, I mean, it makes perfect sense that their overall responsibility, and they will say this to me, that our overall responsibility is to make sure our tribe stays intact, our tribe is protected. A good example of that, for example, is the Shaitat tribe in Deir ez-Zor, which famously rose up against ISIL and was slaughtered en masse for doing so. And I know a couple very prominent Shaitat tribesmen who say, why the hell did we do that? They wanted to show to the international community that they were determined to fight against what they saw as terrorism. And whilst they were doing that, and in the weeks preceding their uprising, they were appealing to their contacts in the Western world for financing and resources to assist them in doing so. And one of those leaders told me, we got $20,000 in cash from one country, which lasted about 3 hours. And then, as I say, pretty tragically, they were slaughtered en masse by ISIL and used as an example of what tribal uprisings will come to. So that hesitancy of risk to take risks is proving very difficult, and I don't foresee necessarily tribes taking a senior role in fighting against terrorism until Assad is gone, at least. Until they feel like they can fight alongside opposition forces, but not by themselves. And there are also, it's worth mentioning, many opposition groups led by tribal leaders, but who refuse to be called tribal militias or tribal factions. So they're even hesitant to identify themselves as a tribally based movement. So the tribes are difficult. They're a good mode or mechanism for engaging societies in those areas of the country, but they're not necessarily the easiest way of rising up against ISIL, unfortunately, much as I think we'd like them to be. The definition of international terrorism. I mean, yes, you're right. Internationally speaking, there have always been difficulties for a variety of reasons to share a common understanding of who are terrorists and who are not. To place this, at least for the purpose of this discussion, within the Syrian context, I think the discussion or the decision having been made in Vienna to draw up a terrorism list, as I said earlier, is a dangerous one, precisely for this reason. For the reason that pretty much everyone around the table in Vienna has a slightly different idea about who is a terrorist and who's not. I don't think necessarily this is a problem that can ever be solved, unfortunately. All countries will always have their own views and their own perspectives. Yes, unfortunately, I don't think there is a way of overcoming that obstacle. But by trying to overcome it, I think you probably risk, especially in the Syrian context, actually causing more trouble than it's worth. And then finally, the anti-ISIL actions. So if the coalition is successful in taking back territory from ISIL, funny, I've never really thought about that before, because there's never been much hope of that taking place anytime soon. I guess if it happened, you'd see an awful lot of outward flows of, for example, when ISIL took over Raqqa, many of the tribal leaders from Raqqa fled to places like Aleppo, and they took many of their family there. They took some of them over the border into Turkey, and all across Syria in tribal areas. When ISIL took over, a similar sort of outward flow of armed groups in particular took place. So I guess if ISIL's territory was taken back, then I think you would start to see some of those guys flowing back to their territory, taking over, and probably just going back to a pre-Mosul kind of status quo situation. If anything, you could probably make the argument, somewhat ironically, that would then by extension weaken the opposition's hand against the regime, because then their forces would be diluted. So it's very somewhat ironic, but I think that probably would be a sort of a long-term consequence.
Thanks. Emil, anything to add?
Yeah, just on this this last question of yours, I would say everything depends on whether, not everything, but much depends on whether Assad is still around or not. And this is something, or whether there is a process that is easing him out of power or not. Mm-hmm. And this is what I worry about, is that we're now stuck in kind of thinking where, we talk about how do we defeat, how do we destroy ISIS, and as if this were this in and of itself was it's an outcome certainly worth it, but it's not an outcome that would stabilize the situation in any meaningful way or allow for a stabilization of the country. I mean, and that's what worries me so much about the current discourse. I mean, we all hope for a better anti-ISIS strategy, and as Charles said earlier, it is a flawed strategy at this point, and not just in terms of the lack of engagement of Syrian indigenous rebel forces, but also in terms of the broader thinking, where for the first 6 months, 9 months, it is an Iraq first strategy, because this is where American issue of legacy in the U.S. and the desire not to be entangled in Syria, etc., make Iraq the focal point. And then the campaign stalls there, and then we realize that the Kurds are doing progress in Syria, so it shifts to a Syria, almost a Syria first strategy, and all this looks totally disjointed for me. And I worry that, I mean, if we were to stumble into a victory against ISIS, because I honestly think that if it happens, it's really by accident, or because ISIS collapsed because of its own incoherences and its internal weaknesses, etc., we're not ready to make the most out of it, and that's profoundly problematic. And another quick point on ISIS, which takes us back to the first questions. I mean, that were asked, is that asking who funds ISIS, who arms ISIS, etc., is understandable, but it is a way of missing the reality that ISIS is no one's creation, no one's instrument. If anything, it's the product of our collective failure. I mean, you can go down the list of every country, whether they're Gulf states or non-Gulf states, Western states or others, and pinpoint mistakes, and many of them are unintentional, that have contributed to the rise of this group. So, the sense that by defining who funds it, you somehow can elaborate a strategy to decisively weaken the group, then in turn this takes us to the defeat of the group, is just missing the point, I would argue. It's missing the point of why this movement has emerged in the first place and has expanded in the past 2-3 years. And that really requires us to be analytically and conceptually very honest about the Middle East. It is the failure of, it's about the weakness of Middle Eastern governments and societies. And Middle Easterner, not just Arab, not just Gulf ones. I mean, there's responsibility here in Turkey, in Iran as well. I mean, Iran, in a way, is indirectly responsible for the rise of ISIS in Iraq. So we have to be honest with this. No one, gets the full blame. All of us get some of it, and that's just a way of making it even more complicated.
Thank you, Emil. I think we can take another 10 minutes, which will be one more round of questions and a return to the speakers. If your hand is at the back, please raise it very high indeed. I can see a hand at the very back at the left. Yeah, Maxime, just there.
Hi, I'm Binal Hart, student from the University of Oxford and from finance and energy sector. I've got basically 2 questions here. Is ISIS or any terrorist organization, the jihadis, are working on any modern frameworks like scenario planning, how they want to see the world in another 20, 25 years? And the second question is, we all agree somewhere that most of the Muslims are not involved in it, so why are we not trying to take the word Islamist out of ISIS abbreviation?
Hang on a second. Could you repeat the second question?
The word Islamist in ISIS is giving an impression to the world that all the Muslims are involved in it, and it's creating a lot of issues at the minute, especially if you see the Facebook and everywhere there's a war going on between friends or best friends. The Muslims are not involved or Muslims are involved. So why are the people not I don't know how to call governments or authorities not working to take the word Islamist out of this ISIS thing?
Okay, thanks. Yes, the gentleman on the aisle at the back there.
Hi, my name's Liam. I work on the prevent strategy, but just interested in this topic. I'm not going to bother with the UK because I feel like we've kind of withdrawn a little bit from the world over the last few years, but I'll turn my attention to the US. My take is the sort of lack of engagement, I guess, with the opposition has been really frustrating over the last few years. And my kind of take, and I just wonder if you think there's something to this, or if you think there's other factors. If it's not just this, you're taking it. One of my takes is that sort of the White House's pursuit of a deal with Iran and the détente with Iran has really scuppered their relationship with the opposition and sort of made them have this sole focus on the deal rather than engaging with the opposition. So yeah, if you think there's something to that or there's other factors, I'd be really interested to know.
Whoever had 45 minutes in the Iran deal sweepstakes has now just won their money. Yes, the gentleman at the front here.
Hello, Tim Verity from the Institute. I just want to ask whether Assad, if he'd been more pragmatic and cleverer, whether he could have done a deal, I don't know, 4, 5, 6, 7 years ago, and held Syria together, rather than being purist in his outlook and wanting exactly and going the direction that he did. If he could have been more pragmatic, could he have held Syria together? Is really my question.
Thanks, Charles. We're going to take 2 more, which is going to make for a long list, but we'll take them all as one and then come back to you. Yes.
Thank you, James Roberts from the Tablet. Could I ask about the Russian intervention, and how do you see the evolution of the Russian targeting, and perhaps even very recently in relation to the presumed understanding with President Hollande?
Thanks very much. And the last question is here in the front row.
from the Institute. Actually, I am going to support the Emily Buchanan suggestions that there should be a research on the rise and growth of terrorism and who are financing them since the last decade of the 20th century to up to date.
Okay. As the Telegraph's name has been mentioned a couple of times already, having seen Richard Spencer's hand go up, you may have the last question.
I was just going to ask Charles to sort of carry on his thoughts, if you like, about the distinction between Al-Qaeda and ISIS ideologically, really. ISIL seems to have created itself as the sort of extremist wing. ISIS has created itself as sort of the extremist militarist, ultra-militarist wing of the jihadist movement, which is almost saying that we don't really have an ideology other than violence, therefore you have to defeat us with violence, with military force. It seems to be the only way, but that's left a sort of much broader jihadist movement from the Taliban through to all the different Islamist factions and some part of Al-Qaeda, some associates, Murabitun, these people who sort of individual agents and actors. Are you, and you say of Jabhat al-Nusra, it's a pragmatic organization now fully embedded in Syrian society, which seems to me to be exactly right. Is the end result of this, as with the Taliban, we have to negotiate with Al-Qaeda. We have to recognize them and try and find some way of co-opting them into a international order, defeating them. We've tried a lot of military options against Al-Qaeda, and it's only made things worse.
Thanks, and thank you all for extremely good questions. I'll turn back to Emile for 1 minute, Charles for 4, and then that's all the time we have.
Yeah, just quickly on the issue of U.S. policy in Iran. There is certainly a sense that U.S. policy towards Syria has been hostage to U.S. policy towards Iran. I don't want to overstate the point. U.S. officials push back a lot against this suggestion. But I think the U.S. had two priorities in the Middle East in the past 6-7 years. Especially since the Arab uprisings. The first one was to avoid any new entanglement in the region. First it was getting out of Iraq and to some extent, but the corollary of that one was to avoid new entanglements in the region. And second, a deal with Iran on the nuclear issue, because it's an issue of global security, because it mattered so much for President Obama, which what is a good thing to diffuse. But taken together, these two essentially precluded a serious engagement over Syria. When I'm nice, I say that U.S. policy towards Syria is weak, hesitant, confused, etc. When I'm not, I call it totally bankrupt, and I prefer to go with totally bankrupt because I think that it just doesn't amount to something that is coherent. I understand that the President Obama in his head is coherent about it, but he does a lot of small things on the sides that send signals, a little bit of train and equipped, but never good enough. A red line that is not enforced. Assad must go, but we're not going to do much about it. We're going to actually train and if you're on the receiving end of this, it looks like essentially he doesn't care, or he cares about one thing, the Iran deal, and that's certainly a very fair perception to have. Then another, just very quickly about whether Assad could have been more pragmatic and clever. Assad would have had to be someone else than Assad, I guess. There was an opportunity. It wasn't, the escalation in 2011 was not meant to go this way. There is a set of choices. There is a fundamental mindset that drove the regime escalation. But we could have sat together and figure out ways to contain this and even to turn it to Assad's advantage at some point. The notion that there was nothing on the table that Assad could have accepted early on that could have prevented that is nonsense. Actually, there were approaches to Assad. There were ideas for, you know, limited political openings and reform, etc., that Assad himself pushed away. So, and by the way, now that we talk about ceasefire, you know, in Vienna, etc., I just want to remind people that there were many plans for ceasefires in 2011, 2012 that Assad himself rejected when he had the upper hand, where actually it would have worked totally to his advantage. So Assad would have had not to be Assad for this to work, and I don't think that's possible.
Thanks, Emil. Charles, final word.
Yeah, thank you, Emil. You kind of did me a favour by answering two of the questions in basically the same way that I would have done. So for the sake of time, I'll try and answer the others. I think if I understood the first part of the two questions, it was whether or not jihadis have a long-term vision 25 years down the line. I mean, yes, I was trying to, within a Syrian context, present the vision that, of course, ISIL's well known. It wants a caliphate. It wants to continue to expand, and that is its long-term vision. It's as simple as that. Al-Qaeda, I think, as I say, has adopted this more long-term strategy, but with very similar long-term objectives as ISIL. I think the difference being ISIL wants all of its results rapidly, fast, right now, and that's it. Al-Qaeda seems willing to now take a longer time to reach the same objectives, with the belief being that taking a longer time is a more reliable way of actually getting there in the end. The second part, you know, having done several public events in the last few days, it's funny, this question keeps coming up, whether or not, for example, whether or not we should call ISIL the Islamic State, whether we should call them ISIL or ISIS or nothing at all, or whether we should call them Daesh. Some people will probably disagree with me, but I kind of feel like in a large respect, ISIL doesn't care what we call them. So we can make ourselves feel better by saying, yes, of course, ISIL is not a representation of Islam, because it isn't. And that makes us feel better. But by making it an official government policy to never call them an Islamic State, or to never call them ISIL or ISIS, or only to call them Daesh, to be really quite honest with you, I think we have much more important priorities in terms of actually fighting the organization than choosing them to call them something or something not. They have written within their publications and made very clear that within their territory they insist on being called the Islamic State, which is perfectly understandable. But they don't have an expectation that the Telegraph is going to always call them the Islamic State, otherwise they're going to declare war on the Telegraph. You know, they really couldn't care less. So I think, you know, my general question, and I don't want to be rude at all in saying it, but I do think, you know, we have much more important priorities to think about than what name to call them. But as I say, some people probably may disagree with me. Russian targeting evolution, I forget exactly who asked that question, but it is a very important one. It has evolved over time. The first few weeks, many of their strikes targeted moderate opposition forces who happened to be essentially in the wrong place in the wrong time. They have targeted more and more members of this coalition called Jaish al-Fatah, which works quite closely with Al-Qaeda, who happens to be a member of this coalition. So, you know, that has made some people in the international community more happy than they were previously. But it's still not necessarily a fantastic thing, because only really one member of that coalition is a designated terrorist organization in the international community's eyes. So it is still problematic, and of course it infuriates the opposition. One thing that particularly got to me, and I think I tweeted about this, was that after you know, Russia deployed these additional heavy bombers the other day, and then celebrated the fact that in solidarity with France that they were targeting ISIL. Well, it's kind of ironic that most of their strikes took place many, many, many miles away from any ISIL territory. So in that sense, the targeting hasn't really changed. I don't think Russia has a serious immediate objective in fighting ISIL. You know, they are there to bolster up Assad's position and to protect the coastline. Al-Qaeda versus ISIL's distinction. Sorry, I'm just reading my notes. Yeah, I mean, ISIL depends on provoking violent retaliation to all of its actions. It's an interdependent relationship. So the really unfortunate reality, you know, we've seen these horrific attacks in Paris. The really unfortunate reality for French policymakers, for the international community, is that exactly what ISIL wants is for us to now pummel Raqqa with airstrikes, which is kind of what's happened. And it puts our policymakers in this almost impossible position, whereby they have to show that they're willing to react, but by doing so they are feeding ISIL's narrative of violence breeds violence, breeds violence, breeds violence, which then justifies the Islamic State's worldview. So I think that in and of itself is a problematic issue. I've received the time notice, so I will answer the final part of Richard's question. Yeah, I think I'm always keen to qualify. When I use the word pragmatism and Jabhat al-Nusra, they are cynically being pragmatic. They are Al-Qaeda, and as I tried to make clear, I think they are actually more of a threat in the long term than ISIL. So I do always want to make that clear. They're not good guys. Whether or not they can ever be part of negotiations, I don't know. I wish I had a few more minutes, because this is a really, really important issue. This is something that Turkey and Qatar in particular have worked very, very hard on in trying to shape Jabhat al-Nusra and force it out of Al-Qaeda. And it's been a quite sharp official policy over the last 6 to 9 months to try and encourage that to happen, both officially, unofficially, directly to Nusra, and through middlemen, through organizations like Ahrar al-Sham. But it's totally failed. And I don't think it was ever going to succeed. Jabhat al-Nusra is an avowed Al-Qaeda affiliate. It will always be that way. And so far as I'm concerned, they'll never have an interest in being part of a political process. But you could, however, argue that, again, these same countries, probably Turkey and Qatar in particular, may have to intervene behind the scenes if a political solution ever does take place, to try and minimize the extent to which Jabhat al-Nusra will then seek to spoil that result. How far they may be able to minimize that, I'm not sure. A lot will depend on what Jabhat al-Nusra looks like as an organization by that time. 6 months from now, it might be easier. There might be a better chance of success of minimizing the extent to which they spoil. But if a political solution takes another 5 years, I think it will be next to impossible to prevent them from trying to spoil it.
Charles, thank you very much. We are over time, for which I apologize, but I think it's been a very worthwhile discussion. So please do join me in thanking both of our speakers.